From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Can't anyone here play this game? That's the question for Republicans in Congress as they experience days of political dysfunction in the House and Senate. The House fails in its attempt to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, and then fails to pass even a bill to send $14 billion to Israel, which has overwhelming majority support. But the House still can't do it. Then the Senate GOP kills a border security bill it claimed to want as a revolt brews among Republicans against leader Mitch McConnell. What's driving the dysfunction? And what does it mean for getting anything done in Congress? That's our topic, and cheerful topic it is, here today on Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the opinion pages, and I'm here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kate Batchelder. Let's start with the Senate and the failure of the border security bill negotiated by Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. The recriminations are coming fast and furious. Only 4 Republican senators voted for the bill. That's Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, and Senator Lankford. So, Kate, who's at fault here?
Well, Paul, I think if you go back to the fall and go through some of this history, you'll find that the Senate conference, the Republicans, picked Lankford to negotiate a border deal that could get to 60 votes in a chamber controlled by Democrats. And they picked him because he had some credibility with conservative lawmakers, unlike others that have in the past waded into the immigration debate. So they picked him for that purpose. He came up with a bill that at its heart would change U.S. asylum incentives. But it really was from the start. I mean, before the deal even came out, there was a group of senators who were opposed to it without even knowing the details. And then when the text finally emerged, and I think it was a political mistake to let it go on for so long, it simply collapsed quite quickly and hemorrhaged support from all over the Republican conference in the Senate. The House said it was dead. But this idea has been that it's somehow James Lankford's fault or it's some nefarious plot by Mitch McConnell when they responded to their conference's requests and demands to look at border changes in tandem with Ukraine, came up with a product, and then it just completely dissolved on impact.
Yeah, went big splat on impact. President Biden and Democrats are already trying to take advantage of this, Kim. They're blaming Republicans for bowing to Trump, and they have a point. That's exactly what they did do. A lot of them were inclined to support the package, or at least look at it, but as soon as Trump came out against it, many of them said, well, I don't want to get on the wrong side of him. And then when Speaker Johnson looked like he was not going to even bring it up for a vote, some of them said, why should I take a risk and vote for something that has no chance of passing? I think the question is politically right here. One question of the impact of this immigration border security failure is whether the Biden accusation that Republicans are to blame for the problems at the border will work between now and November, given that, the crisis really emerged on Biden's watch in his first 3 years, long before this legislative failure. But they are going to try to use this to neutralize the issue.
I don't normally have a lot of time for Chuck Schumer's criticism. It's usually off mark, but I think he's got a real point this time. And obviously, the border is Biden's responsibility and Biden's fault. At the same time, Democrats have moved themselves into a policy position that even a couple of months ago they had said that they would never touch. They have given up a great deal on enforcement. Now, in part because they recognize they have a big border problem. They recognize that only greater enforcement tools are likely to make a difference at this point. But this has been a shift for them. And all along, Republicans had said, hey, you give us border enforcement and we'll be able to sell the Ukraine and Israel package. Let's make a deal. And so now the deal was made and Republicans are fleeing for the hill at the word of Trump. On the question of the politics, do I think that Biden can use this to neutralize this? I think he can use it to some effect, and I think it's going to have a greater impact in places where it really matters, for instance, in the Senate. I mean, the border is very much tied up with Biden's name, but Democratic senators who are up for re-election, like John Tester in Montana, for instance, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, they're going to use this to put some distance between themselves and Biden to say, look, I was in favor of doing this deal, giving the president more tools. Don't blame me. It was the Republicans and those guys we're running against here now that made it impossible. So I think that in individual races, Paul, this could be very, very problematic for Republicans.
Yeah, there's that recorded vote where Schumer brought up the border security and aid to Ukraine package. The Democrats you mentioned, incumbent Democrats, voted to move to debate, and you can bet that's going to show up in $10 or $20 million worth of television advertising in both of Ohio and Montana, maybe $50 million worth of advertising in Ohio as the Senate campaign goes forward this year. Then you also have, Kate, in here, this is almost, sometimes cynicism in politics is so great you just can't keep up. But Chuck Schumer is moving now to just move the supplemental aid bill on Ukraine, Pacific, and Israel, move it forward. And as we are discussing this now, they don't have the votes, 60 votes, to get it through. They might do it. This is just a vote to open the debate here on the Thursday week. But the Republicans, some of them are saying, well, we don't want to vote even to move to debate until we can guarantee we get amendments on, hold your breath, the border. So something they just killed, they now want discrete amendments to say, see, we want to show how tough we are on the border.
Well, that was one of the wild things about the debate over the immigration bill last week. There was this magical thinking that if they killed the border deal, that Ukraine funding would suddenly go poof and they wouldn't have to think about it or take a hard vote on it. Now that the border deal is dead, they're saying, wait a minute, we don't want to take a vote on Ukraine because we told people that we would also do our border priorities and trade those national security priorities. Well, that was something to discuss last week. You are seeing now some discussions of some amendments. Some folks want maybe to vote on the House's H.R. 2, but they don't have a lot of leverage with Chuck Schumer right now after the episodes they've been having of dysfunction for several days now. So I do think there are 60 votes to move forward on debate because there are enough Republican senators who understand why Ukraine funding is important, even if you can't get an outcome on the border. But the question is, some in vulnerable races, some of these other parts of the conference want political cover with a border amendment that has no chance of becoming law.
H.R. 2 being that bill on border security that passed the House. It's a very expansive bill that has no chance of getting 60 votes in the Senate, but the Senate Republicans, some of them want to vote on it. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the ongoing shenanigans in the Senate and the challenge to Mitch McConnell when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch with Kate Odell and Kim Strassel. And we're talking about the Senate dysfunction, and an element of this, Kim, kind of simmering behind the scenes of these votes and the failure on the border security bill is the unhappiness by a significant faction, maybe 10, 15 members of the Senate GOP conference with Mitch McConnell, who's been the leader, the longest serving Senate party leader in Senate history. He is not liked by senators like Josh Hawley and Ron Johnson and Rick Scott of Florida. And they are using this example of the border security bill and what they claim was a failed strategy to raise more doubts about McConnell's leadership. And of course, Donald Trump fanning that because Trump and McConnell had a falling out over the January 6th events where McConnell gave a lacerating speech against Trump. And even though he didn't support convicting Trump in that impeachment trial, he did heavily criticize Trump. And Trump, of course, has never forgiven him for that and would love to oust him as leader. There still is not a majority, as I understand it, in the conference to topple Mitch McConnell, but this insurgency makes it harder for him to govern and control the conference.
To be clear, this is not Mitch McConnell's failing, okay? What everyone had agreed to, as Kate laid out last fall, was, okay, we all agree that if we can get to a place where there are some strong border provisions coupled with Ukrainian and Israel aid, that will be the starting point for Senate negotiations. There was broad consensus among the Republican conference. And Lankford was deputized to do that. He came back having done it. What's changed is the mood in the House and Donald Trump's interference in this. And look, Mitch McConnell cannot move the mountain to himself. He has to have the buy-in of his members. And if they are all fleeing for the hills because Donald Trump is now saying no. There's not much he can do to salvage that. But it comes at an unfortunate time for him. As we all know, last year he had some health problems. I think it sort of shook some people's confidence in his leadership. They largely held back from criticizing him precisely because it was a health issue. But now that he seems to be recovered back in the saddle, it's been a new opportunity for his longtime critics to pull out the knives. And, it's hard to see where this goes here. I do not see him being toppled over this because he does still retain the strong support of many members, even those who currently are fleeing from him on this issue of Ukraine and Israel aid. He's been a very strong voice for that aid, which I agree with, by the way. I think one frustration has been that he hasn't always seen the need to get on board with what has been a new desire among Republicans to cut spending. Mitch McConnell is not known for cutting spending, and that's put him a little out of sync with kind of the central gravity of the House right now and some of the parties. So this is going to be a moment for him. I think he gets through this, but I think it does raise a lot of questions in the coming year, what happens to Mitch McConnell.
Kim, do you agree with Kate that there are 60 votes in the Senate in support of separate aid bill?
I think they get there. Yeah, I do.
You think they get there? The stakes are enormous, Kate, because if they can't pass this, there's going to be no more U.S. military aid to Ukraine. And they're fast running out of ammunition. They're fast running out of 155 millimeter artillery shells in what has become an artillery dominated conflict. They need air defenses, and Russia is slowly going back on offensive and gaining some ground. So my sources suggest that if this aid bill is not passed, that, in fact, Ukraine is really well on the way to losing the war this year.
Yeah, I think this public perception that it's a stalemate has, in many ways, concealed the fact that eventually somebody will break through. The Russians are trying to break through. So the real risk is that it could happen faster than I think the public's really absorbed, to your point, this year. And not just them hanging on, but them losing the war this year. I think that hopefully will start to focus more minds in Congress. But the other thing I'd add is that there is other funding in this bill that these senators who oppose Ukraine would say that they want. For instance, there's $11 billion for supporting U.S. troops that are forward deployed to Europe. We've increased our posture there, having more air defenses, more units. That costs money. We are also trying to ramp up our own ammunition lines. The Senate bill actually pluses up the Biden request for munitions by about $900 million. That is giving us bigger capacity when we know that our arsenals have been not what we'd hoped, that we've had trouble supplying Ukraine. So that starts to fix that problem. So in addition to Ukraine, there's real American priorities here at stake that just don't get any attention in the larger debate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You'd think that would turn these Republicans into being willing to vote for this. I mean, Kate, how large is the faction in the Senate among the Republicans who really oppose any aid to Ukraine and would vote against this on those grounds?
Well, the Senate is not the House. The House has really come closer to 50% of Republicans opposing it. In the Senate, cooler heads have tended to prevail, and there are really 10 or 12 who oppose Ukraine funding entirely. So I think that counsels them getting to 60 votes because I think there are more people in the Senate conference than there are in the House conference who are making a substantive case in why supporting Ukraine is in the U.S. core interest.